Does this work? Good, good, thanks. Yeah. This is M&A. By the way, I hope everybody had a good break. It was cold, wasn't it? This is M&A, and we'll be here until it gets warm in the spring, I hope. And the reason that I'm trying to wear this mic, and the reason that I will ask you to speak into the mics that you've got, is because we record this class in part because if you happen to miss a class, you're able to get it, but also there's some who, for whom the rapid pace of my discussion and your discussion might leave blanks in their notes, and so they can go back and listen to the class and try to figure out what part of it made sense. And also, if you can be heard across the room, it's a lot better for everybody. So this is a course about M&A, particular form of business dealings. What is a merger? What are the mechanics? What are the motives? It's a course about change. Why does this change occur? What's the point of changing who owns a given set of assets? Does merger activity create value or not? Are mergers good for the shareholders? Are they good for the shareholders of the target? Are they good for the shareholders of the bidder? Are they good mostly for the managers? Are they good for everybody else? What about the employees? What about the community in which these firms sit? What about for the nation in which these mergers occur? What about the world? And I say that not in a matter of jest, but because an increasing amount of M&A activity is cross-border. It's global. And so one of the questions that, and I'll give you some idea later in the session today, that occurs is if mergers are global, if they involve cross-border activity, and we don't have a global government, how does the mismatch of the global ambition of these firms, which grow global because of cross-border M&A, how does the global ambition of these firms and the limitations of global governance, how does that work out? One could say a lot about that. So there will be some specific perspectives that the course brings. Mostly a law and finance perspective in the micro sense and the macro sense. In the sense, we're going to try to get good ideas about the motives of the specific parties to the buyer and the seller. So that'll give us notions as to how a particular deal is structured and what the move and counter moves are. That's the perspectives of law and finance for the specific case. But then there's sort of a broader perspective. How do mergers affect the broader economy? Are they good as a whole for the shareholders? Are they good as a whole for the employees? And to do that, in addition to the traditional tools that the lawyer has, we'll need some additional tools because we'll want to be able to look at evidence. And the financial types have produced a lot of evidence, and so part of the part of the ambition of the course will be to give you the tools to begin to get access to the evidence that these finance economists are creating. And so there'll be, a quantitative dimension to a little bit of what we do. And that'll require some of us to stretch a bit. So there's a law and finance perspective. But the key perspective that we'll bring is looking at the transaction. So although we'll discuss M&A from a very broad set of ideas, in the end, the point is to appreciate that the molecule of analysis is the transaction, because that's what lawyers do. We're hired by clients for the transaction that is in front of us, and the point is to be able to appreciate in as deep a way as we can what the transaction means for the parties, the motives, the goals, what can be achieved, what can't, requires both drilling down but also having this very broad view as well. So part of it is the notion that lawyers can add value to the deals their clients bring by this sort of by the perspectives that we'll generate, both in giving their clients better advice and steering things in a positive way rather than a negative way in the actual deals. In the course of what we'll do, you'll get some insight, I think, into some of the key issues of the day, which so frequently pivot from M&A and M&A activity and the moves and the counter moves. And I want to give just a couple examples of this. So, to some extent, this is a history course, as you'll see. A history course that a lot of it begins in the 70s. The hostile bids began in the 70s and the 80s. And the reason it's important really to go back to then in a certain way is as a practitioner, as a young one, knowing where all of these things came from, you're much better able to deal in the present, and you're much better able to deal with the seniors, some of whom will have lived through these very activities. But it's really to see the world as it is today, going back a little bit further is required. So the hostile deals era of the 70s and the 80s were kind of a revolution to managerial expectations of remaining in control, having control being imperial. So hostile deals, which arose for a number of motives, and we'll be discussing them, led to a pushback that basically was validated as a legal matter by the Delaware courts. You know this from the basic corpse class, right? Basically, boards, managers got the right to, quote, to just say no in most cases. But that did not end the story. Indeed, that's merely the beginning. Because given that, the shareholders, the institutional investors who owned the majority of the shares were not pleased that managers could reject the chance to earn a substantial gain on a takeover bid. So what we had instead were a series of devices that aligned the incentives of managers with those of the shareholders. So the way that you would overcome the managerial power to resist the bid is by giving managers such strong incentives to take a bid that that the issue kind of disappears. And so we therefore see the rise of stock-based pay, of high-powered incentives for managers. A lot of stock-based pay, a lot of stock options pay that were put in a form, and we'll discuss in more detail later, in a form that should a hostile bidder show up, the CEO would not only have an incentive because of owning stock in the firm to do what a shareholder would want, but because of the way that the incentives, the stock options were set up, the pay package for the CEO would be accelerated. The options would vest all at once, and it was not only that the manager had powerful incentives to accept the bid. Back up. It's not only that the manager didn't resist the bid, the manager now had powerful incentives to accept the bid because that's the way the CEO could get truly rich, right? So, so because of the hostile bid rejection by the Delaware Supreme Court, we have a set of alternative arrangements that gives managers high-powered incentives. So, 3 developments today, relevant to today, flow directly from M&A, hostile bids, courts, stock options, etc. Right? 1, stock options or other stock-based pay now gives managers, they give managers strong reasons to improve the performance of the firm. Whether or not there's a hostile bid or not, you still want to improve the performance of the firm because your stock options or your stock-based pay is going to increase in value. What if you can't improve the performance of the firm in an actual sense? Well, you can still report that the firm's performance has improved, i.e. fraud, right? So the high-powered incentives give managers incentives both to improve performance but also to report improved performance, which is to say it increases the level of fraud, which produces debacles like the Enron case and countermeasures to control fraud, such as the Sarbanes-Oxley bill, which some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with from SecReg and other courses. So that's one immediate entailment of M&A and the back and forth that I've described. Second, the high-powered incentives put in place to deal with what the Delaware court has wrought are given not only to managers of non-financial firms, they're given as well to managers of financial firms. The failure of a non-financial firm is not a big deal, right? I mean, a diversified shareholder typically wants firms to take reasonable risks, which will lead to the failure of some firms on average. A dynamic economy depends upon businesses taking risks, and stock-based pay gives managers to be aggressive about taking risks. However, stock-based pay, high-powered incentives, given to the managers of systemically important financial firms cash out quite differently, right? Because if a systemically important financial firm fails, we have a financial crisis, and a lot of the costs are not internalized by the firm, the managers, the shareholders, and the creditors of the owned firm, but precisely because the failure is systemic, much of the costs, almost all the costs, are borne by society as a whole, which means that the same set of high-powered incentives which work out well in the case of non-financial firms give the managers of financial firms incentives to take what is, from the social point of view, far too much risk. And so this defect in the compensation system which we put in place to deal with the Delaware courts shutting down of a hostile bid market, this limitation, the defect, we found out much to our regret a decade ago. But understanding how it came to be that managers of financial firms had these high-powered incentives, you need to appreciate M&A of the 70s and the 80s. The third point, which is on the minds of some, is inequality of income in society writ large. It didn't used to be the case that CEOs of even the largest firms actually got that much in pay. I mean, why do they get paid so much? Tens, hundreds of millions of dollars in the case of an accelerated stock option package in the, when they're target. Well, 10s, 20s, 30s, 40s, millions of dollars. Managers used to get, $1 million. A lot of money, but not serious money. And again, there are studies. There's a Berkeley economist named Emmanuel Saez, working with a guy named Zuckman, who are of the view that compensation is a significant source of income inequality in the United States. One that's disputable perhaps, but that's a serious claim. And where does this inequality come from? Well, it comes from the effort to come up with an alternative way to align managerial and stockholder incentives in the M&A market. So this is my point. In understanding M&A, and not just M&A, but the game in which it sits, you get insights as to the legal framework of anti-fraud protection and internal controls in firms, which are a big deal. You get insight into the financial crisis, which is we still live in the shadow of, even though some of you were, probably wearing bibs when it occurred. Third, we're dealing with a present huge social issue, what some think is a big issue of inequality. So, there's a lot on the table here, and the point is, in doing this class, the goal is to give you really an understanding of a certain part of the world as it has evolved to the present moment. And, we'll have some more to say about that along the way. Another point that another perspective is that I hope you'll get some insight about. I'm sure you've seen from the various news articles about the activists, right? The Ackmans, the Icons, Trian, who challenge managements running proxy battles, looking for board seats, etc. Well, that's not actually M&A. I mean, in the sense that the goal, many of the activists have as a goal to get management to look for M&A, perhaps, but it's not directly M&A. But it's part of the same spectrum of activity in the sense that if you see M&A as a mechanism by which firms are forced to adapt to change, the environment will change, and so the first best way of putting assets together will change. The activism is also a mechanism to try to force firms to adapt to change. At least that's what its proponents would want to believe, right? And so there isn't a division between the activism on the one side and M&A on the other. Rather, it is a spectrum. And one way to think of it is if the difference between the current management teams running of these assets leads to, say, a 50% difference between the current and maybe first best, then you get M&A activity, a hostile bid. Because even paying a premium of 30%, there's still significant gain that an acquirer can make on the deal. But if the potential gains are more on the order of maybe 15 or 20%, maybe you get an activist showing up who, given his or her or its business model, can make money with a smaller gain. And so again, the whole idea of disciplinary activity here, M&A on one side, the activism on the other, there's a spectrum. And to understand the ways in which they're similar and different is again part of the perspective that I hope we'll bring to the course. All right. So, again, the goal here is to give you a perspective on M&A as an activity, a perspective on the broader economic framework in which it sits, and in ways I'll describe in a minute. There's a lot of reading in the class. There's a lot of work. Some of it will be stretching for those of you who haven't done quantitative stuff or read economic policy stuff. But there's going to be a lot of traditional lawyer stuff in the course as well. But, I've maybe taught more M&A lawyers than anybody in the United States at this point. And my goal for you is when you walk in on your first day at the firm, if that's where you go, and if you do M&A, many do, who've had this course, then you'll be able to talk in a way that when the partner or senior associate engages with you, you get the good work. Because he or she appreciates that this person kind of is into the game. He or she kind of sees the big picture, and so I can trust that person with this meaningful part of the work to be done because he or she will see where it all fits in, and you get less of, inevitably, first-year associate work, which is not as entertaining. And so, that's a kind of a basic, and then obviously your career flourishes every day afterwards. But the point being is to put you in a position to where you feel like you know what you're doing. And, if your hands are somewhat on the wheel, you'll feel like you know, a direction to go in. We could come up with more metaphors if there's sailing metaphors if the wind comes. Anyway, but the point is it's to give you a real sense, fairly as sophisticated as we can grab as to how M&A work is done, but also the broader setting in which it fits so that, kind of you're ready to go. And so although it will sound like it's a theoretical course at times or a law professor's course, it is not, I promise you. Or at least, this is the feedback I get from the students who have said, who I guess I've heard back from. The ones who hate it, I guess you never hear back from. But anyway, all right. So what are the materials? There is a case book, which is in the middle of revision, which is unfortunate, but it's fortunate in a way, but not. So, but basically, instead of having you buy an out-of-date book and have me give you stuff, what I'm doing is putting the third edition will be posted on an online basis, basically. So there won't be any expense in buying a book, but you may want to print out pieces of it to aid in your reading or whatever, but it'll be online. There will be other materials that are online as well. And as I say, there's a fair amount of reading, particularly for those who haven't done some of the basic stuff before, but it's not trivial reading, I hope. The exam. It's a two-part exam, which most everyone hates. The first part of the exam is a weekend exam that consists of essays, sort of a fact pattern exam and a policy exam that you get to show your facility with empirical evidence. And then the following Monday, there's a short answer exam, a multiple choice exam, rather. And the reason is the multiple choice exam is about statutes and regs. The exam, the essays are mostly about fiduciary duty and strategy and tactics and stuff, and policy, of course. And I've never been able to write an exam where you write an essay question that really tests whether people have a good sense of the statutes and the regs. And the reason for wanting you to get to focus on the statute and the regs is because it's what you'll often be required to do as a lawyer. So you'll be sitting in your office and somebody will be buying a block of stock, maybe thinking about a bid, maybe thinking about an activist move, whatever. But he or she will want to know, do I need to file something? I sort of had this idea that if you go over a certain threshold, you got to file, and all that's, except I've got the folks who are buying are together are doing it like this. Do I have to file? There is an answer to this question, right? It is in the regs. And, a lawyer in this field needs to know, I need to look at the 13D regs and work my way to this provision, and there will be an answer to that question, right? Or I'm about to do a or I want to do a M&A deal, and what percentage of the shareholders' approval do I need? Is it just a plurality of the shareholders who show up at the meeting, or an absolute majority of the outstanding stock? You know, this matters a lot, because if if all I need is a plurality of the shares, then maybe I can get away with a lower bid. You know, hundreds of millions of dollars might be at stake. So what's the answer? Counselor. There is an answer. It is in the statute. And you might not need to know that sort of as you sit here today, but you need to be able to say, well, that's in section 251C. I will look that up. And that's the point of the short answer, the multiple choice exam, is to present discrete questions for which there are answers in the statute and the regs. And one of the takeaways of this course is that to be a complete M&A lawyer, you need to have facility with that material. Not to know it necessarily off the top of your head, but to be able to thumb through and come up with an answer in a reasonable period of time. And so I can't figure out another way to give folks the right incentives except to, have a stock option tied to, is to have an exam that tries to test that. So that's part of the reason for this exam. Class prep. So in general, I'd like to think that everybody reads everything every day, but that may not be true. And for the first few weeks, the finance material, which I'll say a little bit more about in a minute, everybody's on call. And the reason for that is because the finance material that we're going to do, it's not to make you whizzes with a spreadsheet. I don't have that ambition, or even able to compute a correct answer. It's to give you the intuitions about present value, about risk, about option theory, which are critical to your being able to do a good job for your client. Your clients are dealing in the economics here. They will understand this stuff. And again, you need the intuitions about it in order to be a lawyer in this field. Not to mention the fact that when you read Delaware cases, it's pretty clear that, that the judges have great sophistication about this material. So it's to help you be players in this field. And it's particularly important for those who've had no finance before. Obviously, those who've had finance, the 2-week period is not enough to give anybody who doesn't start from a deep understanding an advanced sense, nor is it long enough that those who already know it will feel bored by the tedium of it. But, it is an effort to convey certain core ideas which I think are extremely important. Okay, so basically what I will do is after we finish the finance materials, and when we get to a point where I think it's good to assign folks, then I'll call on folks and I'll sort of set up panels and work in that way. So the TAs. So will the TAs put their hands up? So Sam and Danielle will hold TA sessions. When things settle down, we'll figure out what are the good times to meet. And particularly for the finance stuff, I think that might be important for some for whom this is not familiar. I think there will be, traditionally, the TAs have been a lot of help throughout the whole course to students and just getting a really clear idea of things that seem not so clear to them at the outset. And so how many folks could meet to get a sense of time? After this class, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, immediately after, how many can meet on a Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday? Is there anybody who could not meet on any of these 3 days after this class? A few. Okay, well, we'll try to figure out some way to come up with times. Okay, before I go on to the material, questions about mechanics or anything else? Okay. So, M&A activity has been an important and debatable feature of the economic environment in the United States for 100 years. And it's commonplace to think of merger activity as coming in waves, which are clustered in time. And at each point, when the waves have been intense, the issue has been, well, why? What's the economic motive for the wave? Is it one that is generally beneficial? Is it an effort by the merging parties to grab economic rents to take unfair advantage? Is it promoted by the middle people who get fees? Is it sort of a speculative activity that involves a lot of risk-taking? Are there efficiencies? And the answer is, to all of those things, yes. I mean, generally, it is all of those things. So let me give you an example of that. So it's the first big wave in the United States is a horizontal wave around the turn of the 20th century, in the 19th, 20th. And it involved the merger that created large enterprises like the big steel firms or the big oil firms, Standard Oil, U.S. Steel, similar firms in different businesses, textile firms whose names we've forgotten today. Now, why then? Why then? Well, one thing to note is the explosion of much lower cost transportation. Railroads, eventually roads and cars. And, to some extent, the railroads crossed the U.S. in part because there was gold in them Bar Hills, which all of a sudden created motives to build economic links between the East and the West Coast. With all the gold coming from California, the goods were being shipped, the gold was going east. Let's build a railroad. So all of a sudden, we have a change in sort of something outside steel. But notice what the railroads did is change the optimal scale size of a steel plant, because the transportation costs of shipping steel radically declined. So basically, before the railroads, maybe before the improvement of roads, maybe asphalt is a part of the story. In a sense, the cost of shipping steel was so expensive that you had a bunch of steel plants for each community. I mean, the optimum size of a steel plant conditional on the shipping costs was relatively small. Because if you had a big plant, by the time you shipped it on these cruddy, rutted roads, the cost, the delay, etc., it would eat up. So that extra cost would overwhelm, in effect, what a plant in the locality, which was maybe less efficient at creating steel, could charge for the total delivered steel package, right? So if all of a sudden you have the railroads, which dramatically lower the cost of shipping steel, then the best size, the most efficient size for the steel plant becomes much bigger. So where does this story go? To kind of telescope it, it leads to mergers. The horizontal roll-up of all of these smaller steel firms into bigger firms, pursuing scale economies, pursuing efficiencies. So the horizontal merger wave, to some extent, was to obtain efficiencies, to use the efficiencies of a larger size productive plant, which now can take advantage of the fact that the transportation costs have, as an input, have radically declined. So, an efficiency story. But if you also buy up all of your rivals, guess what? You can also raise the price of steel. So that's a redistribution story. The goal is to take money from some of the consumers of steel and deliver it to the producers of steel. An anti-competitive motive. And the third, there are all these investment bankers running around who are going to be earning fees from putting together the mergers. And they may put together mergers, some of which are good, some of which are not so good. The price that the target shareholders receive may be too much or too little. And then the stock market booms, which means that acquirers can use their appreciated stock as currency, is going to affect the willingness of parties to engage in a merger. All of these things are occurring at the same time. And that's part of the story, is that you can't easily untangle elements of what's driving M&A activity in the moment. There are some probably external shocks, which means that there are now more efficient ways of putting production together. There are efforts to try to grab more from consumers if you can. There are always the middle people, the investment bankers and the deal promoters. Think just today of the merger between the proposed merger between AT&T, and Time Warner. We're going to discuss tomorrow more about the Time Warner story, but you know, AT&T is got mostly what? A distribution system. And Time Warner has got some channel. It's mostly a content provider, movies, but it's got these channels, HBO, etc. So you know, a distribution system, which AT&T is, and a content provider, which what Time Warner is. That's kind of a vertical connection, maybe some efficiencies there. But guess what? There's certainly the antitrust litigation that has been brought to challenge that merger is precisely because of what is deemed to be the anti-competitive effects, which is to say the efforts of the parties to grab more of your money. So their efficiency there's a simultaneity issue here, right? At the same time that there may be efficiencies associated with some of the integration of productive capacity, there may also be efforts to redistribute in favor of the owners of those firms. There are organizational innovations that may drive M&A activity, or what we think are the latest ideas. So, I speak here of conglomerate mergers. And leverage buyouts. And we will speak a lot more of each of these. But just to be brief, again, this is part of the notion of these different waves showing, to some extent, the multiplicity of motives for M&A activity and what seems new in the effort of the M&A activity to take advantage of it. So, in the 50s, with the advent of computers, really, it became possible for a headquarters to gather financial information about multiple pieces of the business. And so the theory was that there was an economy of scope, that managers or shrewd financial overseers could monitor businesses in many different lines of work, actually. A single manager could monitor the sub-managers of an insurance firm, of a telecommunications firm, of a manufacturing firm, all under the same ownership umbrella, because after all, profit and earnings and revenues, they come out as numbers. And you could use the information the computer puts out and see whether the managers are doing a good job. That was kind of the intellectual idea, the organizational innovation behind the conglomerate merger. Again, we're going to say more about that later. You know, it was a theory of organizational efficiencies that led to a lot of M&A activity. This experiment was deemed to be a failure. People aren't that smart, even with great computers. We're still in the midst of another innovation. This is the leverage buyout. The idea that a firm which was financed mostly through debt finance rather than stock finance could give managers incentives to perform better. Organizational innovation, right? If managers own a tiny amount of the firm's stock and don't meet their targets, what happens to them? Nothing. They don't make a lot of money if they meet the targets, and if they fail with the targets, the firm goes on fine and they go to the next period, right? They go play golf. Under the leveraged buyout form, managers own a lot of stock, and the firm is financed with debt rather than stock. What the difference between debt and stock is that debt requires fixed payments of the interest and repayment of the debt itself, right? So you're captured by the amount that you need to pay out on an annual basis, the interest payment, the debt repayment. And if you fail to achieve that, then not only does the value of your stock go to zero, but boom, the firm goes into a bankruptcy proceeding, you lose your job. So the claim is an organizational innovation like that should spur firms to greater efficiency. And a lot of M&A activity has been fueled out of the organizational innovation that I've just described. Okay, all right. I want to spend some time now discussing the M&A landscape circa the beginning of 2018, based on what happened in 2017. Okay, whoops. Is this thing not working? Shucks. Why this is not working is... Doggone it. Okay. What this was supposed to show you, you had this chart in your folders, right? It was distributed to you, and it shows that global, okay, all right. Okay, yeah, good. Here's global M&A volume. That is $3 trillion. So basically, for the last 4 years, the level of worldwide M&A is $3 trillion. That is a lot of money. There have been bigger years in the time of the dot-com boom, when tomorrow you'll read about Time AOL, which was, a $100 billion deal that was vaporware. That's how you got to those numbers. But what we see is that after the financial crisis, which led to a nadir in 2009, M&A has been steady but steadily picking up, and that this is a third quarter figure, so we will be over $3 trillion for 2017. I'm sure it's why many of you are in this class, is because of the legal work that will flow from this M&A activity. All right, so the interesting thing here that I want to show you is the difference between So this is take a look, and this is in your materials as well, the number of deals in 2017, the total worldwide global deal volume, which is right here, the very, very top, is 49,000 and change. And that's the number of announced deals. And the number of completed deals is roughly 37,000. So first, notice that there are many deals that are announced that never get finished for reasons that, we'll discuss some in the class. But even so, deals finished, 37,000 deals. That's a lot of lawyers. What commonly happens, however, is that attention is typically paid to the large deals. So, and the large deals are, in 2017, basically 1,100 large deals, which is to say over $500 million. So remember, there were, depending on how you count it, roughly 40,000 deals in 2017, of which 1,100 deals were over $500 million. So the part of what this shows is that there are a lot of very large deals, but there are also a huge amount of small deals. M&A activity is done. In some sense, it's very common. It's frequently used as a way of doing economic activity, right? But the large deals obviously draw the attention of the press and also more high-powered lawyers, and the size of some of the large deals is really quite stupendous, right? So this gives a timeline of the largest deals of this year. So there was a pharma deal at the beginning of 2017 for $29 billion. Some other pharma deals in the spring. And look what gets announced at the end, right? CVS, Aetna, Broadcom, Qualcomm. The CVS Aetna's $68 billion deal. The Broadcom, Qualcomm, $128 billion. So just think a little bit as to what is reflected in these large deals, right? So the large deals all right, so, and the mixed motive, that's part of what, I want you to see is sort of a lot of things going on to motivate a merger. And, a sophisticated lawyer, it's part of your job to think about this, right? So CVS, Aetna. CVS, you've seen CVS, it's a drugstore chain, right? And if you go to a CVS, you sort of think of it as a grocery store, right? But it's a drugstore chain, and it's kind of its core business is selling over-the-counter medications and also prescription medications. And it has a side business of healthcare service provision. You can go into a CVS and get a flu shot. Or I think in some CVSs and get counseling about, some low-level medical issues, a cold maybe. Aetna is an insurer. It's a health insurer. And many of us have Aetna plans or have had Aetna plans. And I don't want to go into a full bore description of the health insurance business, but you know, it's significantly about putting together doctor networks. It's significantly about risk shedding, but not so much, really. Insurers are basically administrators of healthcare provision, putting together the doctor networks and arranging with employers how to control utilization of healthcare services. So this merger, that's the point. This merger is a bet about how to reshuffle the organization of the provision of healthcare. This merger is a bet that Aetna, which is, you know, it's not an insurer so much in the sense, I mean, one thinks of an insurer as risk spreading. That's not what insurers do today in the U.S. healthcare system for the most part. Mostly what they do is they administer the provision of healthcare services. And if you think CVS is trying to move its business model partly in that way, you get a flu shot, that's a healthcare service. So this merger is about the oncoming way to transform the healthcare services provision business. That's what's going on here. In light of changing reimbursement rates at the federal level, about employer demands for more efficient provision of healthcare, etc., right? So that's a pretty significant thing. Who knows if it'll be successful? The Broadcom and Qualcomm, they make chips, and that we have in our phones. It's a consolidation move, and maybe the point there is. And Broadcom and Qualcomm compete with one another. Guess what that does? Two chip providers competing with one another lowers the cost of chips. So maybe a merger of that type is an effort, a horizontal merger, an effort to let these firms protect their prices. That's a nice way to put it. But the point is, these huge mergers are kind of efforts to transform the economy in the areas in which these firms work. Okay, all right. So M&A by region. I mean, so back up. The point is, M&A, the small deals. There are 40,000 of them a year. There are 1,100 big deals a year, and some of them are an effort to transform the economic space within which these firms work, right? There's normal science and extraordinary science that goes on in the M&A world, and that's why the deal size, while you know the number's nice, but it may also mean that the ultimate ambition is also different than in smaller deals. Okay, M&A volume by region. This is the third quarter of 2017. What we see is that the United States accounts for the biggest share of M&A activity, 38%. Europe, which is a market that is the same, the EU is a market of the same size as the US, but look at the level of M&A activity. It's a little more than a half of the level of M&A activity in the US. So you can think, I mean, you know, one could write a nice piece of work about why that is so. Why two markets of the same size in terms of GDP and people have such different levels of M&A activity? What are the for those who've studied EU law or maybe from there, you can think of the barriers that make it a lot harder to do a merger within the EU than, say, within the United States, even though there's supposed to be a single market in Europe. Anyway, and of course there is this 20% of China, 20% for China. So China is looming as a very significant player on the world economic stage. China is, in its M&A activity, significant part of which is internal, of course, has the same level of M&A activity as Europe. Obviously, the economy of Europe is much bigger than China. Okay, so let's focus on worldwide cross-border activity, because I said before that that M&A is a worldwide phenomenon. It's a global phenomenon. It transforms the global economy through cross-border M&A, and the level of cross-border M&A, if you look at this figure, is roughly 1.2 trillion. And what you see is that the level of cross-border M&A, 34.6% this year, is a substantial fraction of all the M&A activity in the world. So yes, most of M&A activity is within border, right? It's a U.S. firm buying a U.S. firm. But a third of all M&A activity in the world is cross-border M&A. And if you think about sort of like, you know, a global world order or whatever, or the global economy, or the things that knit nations together and reduce the chance of war, that's one way to put it, global M&A activity which tie businesses together in webs of ownership and control, you know, this is where it is, folks. And global M&A, this chart goes back to 2008, has been, you know, apart from the financial crisis times, a roughly $1 trillion a year business for a decade, and it accounts for roughly a third or more of all M&A activity in the relevant period. All right, so I want to speak a little bit, because we mentioned China, about China. Okay, so look at, this is China's cross-border announced M&A activity. So this is all of China's cross-border M&A. The interesting feature here is that the predominant amount of cross-border M&A activity that China is engaged in is outbound China M&A activity rather than inbound. In other words, there are Chinese acquirers, many Chinese acquirers and acquisitions of non-China targets. There are relatively few non-China acquirers of Chinese target firms. Now, this is becoming a very serious concern to policymakers in the United States and Europe. And we'll be kind of reading about it in the course of this semester, I suppose. Curtis Milhaupt and I are writing a paper on this phenomenon, and briefly put, I mean, as you'll see, historically, there have been two kinds of acquirers in the M&A market. There's been a financial bidder, financial acquirer, and a strategic acquirer. So the financial buyer is a party who, in effect, thinks that the firm is undervalued by the market, in part, perhaps, because the organization of the firm, the business units put together, create negative synergies within the firm. And that a financial buyer who's clever can break up the firm, sell off pieces, bring in additional resources to fund other pieces, and create value in the course of doing the M&A activity, but is not itself a person who would operate the firm. It's a financial buyer. On the other hand, the other kind of buyer is a strategic buyer. When Apple buys a small firm that has a team that has a really good voice recognition device, which became Siri, that M&A activity, Apple was a strategic buyer. When Facebook bought Instagram, it was a strategic buyer. It saw, Zuckerberg saw immediately how Instagram would fit into its business model, or the threat to its business model that an Instagram on its own might present. Strategic buyer, right? China, the challenge of China is China brings to the fore a new kind of buyer, a national strategic buyer. That is to say, previously, these financial buyers, strategic buyers, were acting for private economic motives. They were acting to make the shareholders of the principals of the strategic or financial buyers, the case may be, rich. And parties, that was their motive, private economic motives. A national strategic buyer is in service of a national strategy. So here's the problem. We don't have an international global M&A regime, a formal regime. There's no WTO. This stuff is not really done by treaties. It's done by, in effect, an understanding among the economically developed nations that since all these firms are acting largely for private economic motives, if a U.S. firm buys a French firm, it's to make money for the U.S. firm and the shareholders, some of whom will be French because they can buy their shares on an open market, right? And similarly, if a French firm buys a U.S. firm, the goal is to maximize the pie, as it were, and shareholders of any nationality can buy into those gains because these firms can be bought and sold on a public market, roughly speaking. The entry of the national strategic buyer is inconsistent with this regime. The motives of the firm, the contestability of the firm, the ability of others to benefit in an economic sense from the gains associated, completely different than the M&A, the global M&A regime that we had previously had. And it's not, you know, the claim of our paper, this is not stable. And there's going to be an eruption which is occurring right now. It's being put in the form of national security concerns. But it goes much deeper to the terms on which the global M&A regime will go forward, where some of the acquirers are these national strategic buyers. All right, so let me see if there's anything else. All right, yeah. You know, we're gonna run out of time. We'll finish a little about this tomorrow. So, you know, in closing, for today, I want to make a prediction. Right, there will be a lot of M&A activity this spring. Because of the tax bill, the tax law, U.S. firms will be bringing back potentially in the trillions of dollars. These tax cuts all of a sudden will give firms money that will burn a hole in their pocket. They have three choices. Let the money sit in a bank account. The interest rates are not great. They could give it to the employees. That's somewhere between 0 and 0 chance that will occur. Absent competitive market pressures to pay employees more, but it's not going to happen unlikely to happen. I'll say that. They could give it back to the shareholders. A lot of that will happen. Or they could do M&A, right? Managers have now got, they're literally, you know, they've just gotten paid. You know, they're teenagers who've just gotten their first check. And they're sort of, you know, in the shopping mall, right? Are they going to put it in give it to mom and dad to save for college? No. Anyway, so my prediction is that we will see very robust M&A activity as firms are looking for strategic advantage. They have a lot of cash to pursue these deals. The stock market is going nuts, which historically has been a very favorable time for M&A because it seems like things are going to boom forever. So I think we'll see a lot of cool M&A this spring, and that'll be great for the class, right? Because, part of what I hope you'll do, if you don't already, is read the relevant parts of for this course of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, because every sophisticated deal lawyer in the world reads those papers because it, you know, the latest deal is described there, the strategy is described there. One of the pleasures you'll get from this course is over time you'll become an increasingly sophisticated reader of the activities and the actions described in the business part of the Journal and the Times. And so, you know, I'm sure we will have many deals to follow in the course of the semester. And I'm looking forward to spending the time. So tomorrow we'll discuss a little bit more based on the description of 2017, but most of our time we'll be looking at the specific deals, the defense business deal and the Time Warner deal, which are in the chapter 1 of the materials. And part of the point, again, is to try to figure out what were the motives of those parties and what were the factors that influenced their deal-making activity. Because each of those gives great stories as to how those deals occurred and some of the stresses along the way. See you then.
Can I start your email?
Yes.
When are your office hours? I'll come stop by your office.
Send me an email about when you have availability, because I'm given. I should have said a thing to that effect. I mean, ordinarily it's easier to make a specific appointment with me
Okay, so I can just email
because your times and my times often are not going to match.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. I'll
Okay,
send you an email.
all righty. See you. Hi.
I know it doesn't look good to be concerned about the exam this early on, but I was just wondering, when you say weekend, is it
Take
48 hours?
No. Well, it's basically. Let's see, how does this work? It's a 24-hour take-home, which means that Friday to Sunday, which means any time beginning Friday at 9 a.m. and Sunday or Monday, not 9 a.m. I mean, you have to pick it up and return it within that period.
Oh, I see.
And once you download it, you get 24 hours before you have to upload it.
So there's
right?
some flexibility, and it's like a 24-hour.
Yeah. I mean, you self-schedule in that period, and they've set up. System in which you're able to download and upload without actually being in school.
Okay. I haven't had something that long, so I'm just curious about how it works.
Well, the theory is that the exam will not take 24 hours.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's mirror. So people will not go crazy. That's okay.
Okay.
And you are.
I'm on that.
Okay, and you're a 2L or 2L?
3.
Okay. All right.